Radio. Reporting to danger. Unafraid. Right here, where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio! The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on this Christmas Eve. For some of you, it might be Christmas. I think somewhere it is Christmas as of now.
It is Christmas in Australia at this point. I know that.
Okay, there we go. And it's a Christmas miracle. My lovely partner Leah is joining us, even though she was under the weather for a little bit.
Yeah, any apologies in advance to our listeners for any sniffling on my end.
And luckily, I didn't catch any of it.
Not yet.
Today we're going to continue the discussion. Let me share the screen here for those that are viewing this tonight. We're going to continue the discussion with the Younger Dryas event and the impact theory. The Younger Dryas impact theory that was posited in 2007 by Firestone and others. And a book came out that year, The Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophes. And we shared the PDF with you on our show on Oppenheimer Ranch Project last night, and will be linked below here. The free PDF, the full book, 416 pages. Flood, Fire, and Famine in the History of Civilization. Now, before we dive into it, let's just start with the title. I have so much lined up here, and the amount of research we've been doing for weeks continuously. It's like I have so much information lined up here. We could talk for the next 12 hours about just the graphs I have up, because the deeper you dive into a subject, the more you uncover, and then all the pathways, it's dendritic. They network out in all these different directions, and you can go down all these rabbit holes. It's crazy making.
Well, and there's also a lot that happened in the past, and a lot of those events are linked to each other. So there's just endless amounts to talk about.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the picture is becoming crystal clear that when people talk about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, or they refer back to the Younger Dryas event as a civilization-ending event, that's not true. They're just using a catchphrase. There are so many things going on before the Younger Dryas event, like the bowling alley rod warming, the sea level rising 1,500 years before that event, and then the end of the Younger Dryas event, and then another meltwater pulse, which happens after 10,000, which is more recent, around 10,000 years ago. So this is more like a 5,000 year period in our past that was a nightmare to be part of.
Yeah, and calling it, suggesting that it was a singular event of some kind is pretty erroneous.
No, and I think we'll prove that to you today. I think the purpose of this show will be to prove to the public that there are multiple things going on, and there are multiple cause and effects. Where one thing causes one thing one time, the same thing may cause the opposite another. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, not really, but yeah, we'll make it make sense. We'll explain it.
Well, yeah, we will. Now let's just talk about the title here of the book by Firestone and Alan West and Simon Warwick and Smith. They say here, flood, fire, and famine in the history of civilization. I find it humorous. If you talk to modern archaeologists or anyone in the mainstream at university level, no one is going to agree that there was civilization before the Younger Dryas. That's ridiculous. And yet here we have a book.
There was.
Yeah, here we have a 400+ page book. I don't even know if I'm on camera. That you can all get for about $20. You can get a used copy. I don't know if they have a reprint of it, but it is a fascinating read. It is chock full of information on things that are going on during this time period. And do you have anything to add there?
Well, it's just fascinating to read this too, because it kind of gives a clear picture how in some cases certain events triggered like a domino effect of events. So
Yeah,
it's
well,
like this one nightmarish thing happens, and then there's like 10 more nightmarish things that happened after that.
Yeah, I
What
have
a
up
crazy
on the
time to live.
I've up on the screen one of the craziest periods during that time frame, which is the Younger Dryas period, which begins with an event at 12,900 years ago and ends with an even more abrupt event at the end of it, 11,500 years ago. And during that interval, we're back in this dark ice age after we had just come out of it a few thousand years before, where it was nice and warm. So, but it wasn't nice and warm in the sense that everything was hunky-dory. This is a nightmare is happening. Sea level is rapidly inundating all the coasts, and if there are any peoples on those coasts, which there were, because civilizations tend to build by the shoreline, their whole cities and communities were being engulfed by the ocean. Now, did they know about it?
In advance, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, from the little excerpts that I've been reading that are the mythological excerpts that would seem to describe what was going on would suggest that they didn't know about it in advance, that people were taken by surprise.
Yeah. And if sea level all of a sudden rapidly starts coming up, you're like, okay, maybe it'll go down, right? And then it keeps coming up. How long do you wait until you realize we got to go?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you move your stuff a little bit up to the high ground and you watch as it keeps coming up.
Right.
And
but at some point, you're not going to be moving fast enough, and it's going to overtake you.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So what we have here is a graph of the Younger Dryas event and the time before and after. This brings us all the way to the nice Holocene warm, which began around 10,000 years ago and has maintained till now. When I say nice Holocene warm, and if you're looking at this graph, the last 10,000 years has been relatively stable, is what we call it geologically, but it has been anything but stable. Back around 8,000 years ago, we had a temperature fluctuation of 3 or 4 degrees centigrade, which is equivalent to a dark age. And you can see in the graph, even though it's minor up and downs, these are all major catastrophic events in a time period where climatologists and scientists call it calm.
I mean, it's fascinating just to look at this graph, because you think about what's on it and you think about, dark ages and how they're depicted and how much chaos that caused for civilization. And then you look back to the older time frame and you're like, oh my God, talk about chaos.
Yeah, because if you just look at the 10,000 year Holocene warm here, all of these low points are civilization destructing events where complete empires were destroyed and reworked. So that's happened dozens of times during the quiet period. If we look at the scale of the events that happened between 11,500 and 15,000 years ago, they are 10 to 100 times fold any of the catastrophes that have happened in the last 10,000 years or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are big events. And not only that, right in the middle at the 12,009 flexure point, which is one of the catastrophic, there's actually at least 3 catastrophic events in this 5,000 year period, but probably many more, because there are intermediate blips here in the first and second Dryas before the Younger Dryas. So what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, and Firestone even talks about something happening around 17,000 years ago as well. So I guess prior to that giant temperature spike.
You can see here on the graph, there's this drop down in temperature at 17.
Yeah.
That's that event he's probably talking about. But that also corresponds to a spike in radiocarbon excess, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so we got a spike around then. There's a spike around 14.5. There's a spike at 12.9. I don't know if there's a spike at 11.5, is there?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, so we spikes definitely starting around 17, ending at the Younger Dryas spike of radiocarbon, which is a big one. And that event at the Younger Dryas boundary at 12.9 also contains all of the precursors of cosmogenic markers, meaning microspherules, nanodiamonds, and on and on. Beryllium spike also occurs at that point. So we can definitely say that these events are cosmogenic, but that's a really broad term.
Yeah.
You're gonna say something?
No, I was just going to agree that that is a broad term, and maybe we should define that a little bit better.
Yeah, so what it means, if you read all the literature and all the papers with different conclusions, that it's either coming from an asteroid, because asteroids contain the nanodiamonds and other radionucleotides that would be this cosmogenic marker. It's coming from a comet, because comets are electrically charged. They can discharge above the surface, like we've talked about with the Hopewell airburst event, which happened in the last 2,000 years. For goodness sakes, all we are doing as humans on Earth is waiting for the next comet to come in. And this is provable with the Siberian event that happened in the early 1900s, right?
Yeah.
Tunguska.
Yeah.
If Tunguska were to have happened today at that same spot, millions of people would be dead, and we would have a way different world. Yeah. And here's an interesting fact. If the Tunguska comet was 100 miles to the east, it would have hit Leningrad at that time. And it would have taken out all of Russia. And literally we would be in a different world right now.
That's fascinating to think about.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it just goes to show, and again, I'm, pulling this from the graph itself and what we're talking about now, but Earth is not an easy place to live.
But we've been taught and led to believe that everything is safe and hunky-dory, and you're safe.
And stable all the time. Which
it couldn't be further from the truth. Now, here's the unfortunate thing before we dive into some science here. Well, this is all science, is that the probability of a large bolide coming in and exploding is very high. It's 100%. We don't know when it will happen. It can happen at any time. And they happen quite frequently. So we had the Tunguska event, which would have been completely empire ending if it happened today anywhere continentally, in any continent. It would destroy infrastructure, perhaps. If it hit the right spot, it would be devastating on land. But there is a very 80% chance it'll hit an ocean, and it'll be worse. It will create a mega tsunami that will wipe out more population than any airburst could ever wipe out.
Yes.
Because it's going to propagate, and whatever ocean it hits, it's going to wipe out the population circumferentially around that ocean. If it's in the middle of the Atlantic, hundreds of millions die in a few hours. If it's in the middle of the, go ahead.
Well, the Firestone writes about what the evidence suggesting that there was a mega tsunami first on the east coast of North America, right, and then that trips landslides, which then trips mega tsunamis at Africa. And then the same thing happens again at South America. It's just this domino effect of disaster.
Yeah. And so let's jump into that, and we'll finish up the first half here. The next 15 minutes, let's talk about the mega tsunami in the Atlantic that occurred because of what we'll call it's because of the younger Dryas impactors on the Laurentide ice sheet, because there's multiple things going on at this time. But at 12,900 years ago, an object, very high probability, or multiple objects, hit somewhere above Hudson Bay, might have even formed the Hudson Bay crater or Saginaw Bay, and actually made the craters by pushing 2 miles of ice down into the earth. So this is like an unheard of type of crater formation. We almost never see it on any planet. So it would be very hard to understand what it should look like. Therein lies the first problem.
Yeah.
But we do have evidence. We've got the Carolina Bays and a circumferential impact field of these oblate craters that all point back to where the impacts were. They all point back to Saginaw and Hudson Bay.
Well, and despite the fact that this might be an impact that is different than anything else we can describe or we've seen evidence for, it is very clear that something happened. Just the exact details of that is what's not necessarily as clear.
Yeah, and I want to clear something up. A lot of people are still under the impression that Hiawatha Crater, which is the recent crater they found under Greenland ice, has something to do with the Younger Dryas event. It does not. It's much older. There's new papers out. There are pretty much consensus that it's much older than this event. So that's just a side note.
Is it supposed to be like a couple million years old? Is that what you said before? I can't remember.
Yeah, 1.4 million maybe, or don't quote me on it. I have to go look at it, but it's definitely much older because of some of the evidence that they found. So here we are at Hudson Bay, if you're looking at the graphic. Now, here's the hypothesis. When the comet exploded over Hudson Bay and Saginaw Bay, the shockwave broke loose millions of icebergs and created millions of projectiles. The projectiles were, hit the ground in a circular area around from the impactor. Those are the Carolina Bays and the Nebraska rainwater basins, which we now find may be millions of using LIDAR. And then if you calculate it out, we've talked about this, you're going to have earthquake magnitudes of about 9 happening millions of times in North America. And what you get is liquefaction from the earth shaking so much. And so that's why the bays are all flat and filled in, because the earth cymatics just smoothed it all out.
Yeah. Would that have also caused the landslides?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, anything that has unstable slope is definitely going to move at this point.
Sure.
You imagine the avalanches. I hope no one was skiing. All right, so this big impact occurs, and it smashes up 200 cubic kilometers. We'll get to the actual number in a minute here. A ridiculous amount of ice is vaporized, pulverized, and blasted for thousands of miles. The amount of steam and debris and water vapor that goes into Earth's atmosphere is instantly catastrophic at this point. So there's going to be a secondary effect from all this water vapor. But let's just get to the instant this event happens. Boom! Carolina Bays are formed. The whole North America is shaking at 9 magnitude for maybe hours. And guess what? There's also millions of these ice bolides that then hit in an arc, moving south and west in the Atlantic. And that's going to push one hell of a mega tsunami, a unidirectional mega tsunami, up and into Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I've shown some of the flood structures on Africa. We could pull it up, but it's not important. Anywhere you look on Africa has been inundated by water. It clearly looks like a tsunami washed across the entire continent. And on the backwash portion, as it flooded back out into the ocean, it exposed a very interesting feature in Mauritania called the Eye of the Sahara. Now, this is an erosional feature from an uplift dome that's millions of years old that just so happened to be covered by more recent, easier to erode rock. And after the tsunami, it exposed this amazing feature. Now, a lot of people are talking about it as if it could be Atlantis, which upon just initial inspection doesn't make any sense, because what we're talking about here is a geological feature which is not man-made. It's an artifact of an uplift dome and then weathering to create those concentric rings. So it has nothing to do with building. So that's like immediately. What do you think?
Well, also it's a geological feature that's also extremely old, right? Like millions of years old.
Yeah.
It's funny because just earlier today, I saw somebody trying to make that comparison of Atlantis to the recat structure, and just had to chime in there and say this is not a ruin. It's not a ruin. It's an a geological feature. Excuse me, not archaeological.
Right, and it was
much older than Atlantis, and
only exposed during the Younger Dryas event.
Right.
It's not like Atlantis was there and erased, because the circular rings there have nothing to do with Atlantis. It's a geologic feature. So it's almost like seeing animals in clouds. It's that elementary. It's fantasy.
I mean, it's a cool idea, and I understand the appeal, but when you just look at the basic facts, that's clearly not the case.
And the best account, which is the account from Solon, and the Egyptian priests, and they clearly say geographically where it is. You go through the Straits of Gibraltar, and you hit some islands straight out there.
Right.
And there are something called the Azores, which are out there, but they're just not as big as was once described. But in fact, there are peer-reviewed papers that suggest that the mid-ocean ridge in the Atlantic can rise and fall miles during events. So because of in that plate boundary, which is a divergent plate boundary, a mid-ocean ridge, there can be some type of upwelling to move that ridge up kilometers towards the surface. And then the same thing can happen. It can fall back down. This type of isostasy is driven by tectonics. So you get a magma plume under the mid-ocean ridge and it starts to swell up, buckle, which is exactly what happened to form the recat structure. There was a doming of flat-lying rocks and it formed a pimple, which was then eroded flat, and it looks like a bunch of rings now.
Right. Well, and then of course the Mid-Atlantic Ridge too, right, is one of the major stress fractures on Earth. So if we're talking about a major event like, let's say, a nova from the sun or something like that, it would stand to reason that that fracture would show a lot of the stress.
Or if we're on a growing Earth, like the Earth is expanding, the expanding Earth theory, like back when we were the time of the dinosaurs, the Earth was probably 1/3 the size, which gives us the gravity you need that dinosaurs can live. And since then, outbursts from the sun come into the poles, and there's something going on in the core that's not what we're taught. It's not liquid iron nonsense. It's a plasmoid in the core that is creating matter.
Yeah.
From the energy from these events.
We should do a whole show devoted to that theory.
Yeah, there's a new textbook that was just sent to me, the second edition, just updated this year. And we can dive into that expanding Earth theory. I can even get the author on the podcast with us. So if that's happening and there's this massive solar outburst and the Earth is expanding during this Younger Dryas event and Atlantis is on the mid-ocean ridge, it would be a catastrophe. And in the account of Solon, it doesn't say that they were flooded. It says that the island sunk into the sea and was destroyed by earthquakes. So interesting, the account from the Egyptian priests doesn't say a flood. A lot of people think that the flood of Noah has something to do with the destruction of Atlantis. These are different events, 6,000 years apart.
Yeah, and then you have to take into account as well that if you're a human being standing on land somewhere, a flood is sort of relative, right? So if Atlantis actually sunk, it's not really a flood, it's just that Atlantis sunk. So it's one or the other, right? The land sinks or the ocean rises, but it is all relative. So I think we have to take that into account.
And if your island was sinking, it would certainly appear as if it's being flooded if you're standing on it.
And that's how you're going to describe it if you survive.
Right. And if you're on the mid-ocean ridge and there's something tectonically catastrophic happening on Earth at the mid-ocean ridge, you're going to get earthquakes, major earthquakes.
No question.
In fact, I can prove it to you. There has been a swarm of earthquakes on the Reykjanes Ridge, the mid-ocean ridge, just north of mythical Atlantis and south of Iceland, that's had thousands of 5-magnitude earthquakes over the last few months. Yeah. And this is a very safe place to happen. It's 3 miles under the ocean in the middle of nowhere, so no one is feeling these. But if it can happen in a quiet time like now, can you imagine in an uptick?
Right. Can you imagine when there's all kinds of electromagnetic stress on the Earth because there's something going on with the sun, or perhaps because we had a comet impact or something like that?
Now, when you get and so after these bolides hit the Atlantic Ocean, what's going to be in the Atlantic?
Well, some of the landmass. I mean, the landslides are going to go into the ocean.
Fresh water in the form of these
and that too.
Ice, right. If you do the math, the amount of ejected ice from the Laurentide ice sheet would cover the Earth in 3.5 feet of water, 1.1 meters. So it would freshen the Atlantic instantly, almost into fresh water. And this would stop any of the deep thermohaline circulation almost instantly. It would be like Beaufort gyre being released on steroids.
Yeah.
So any weather patterns that were happening would quickly come to an end and you would dive into an ice age, especially in Europe, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, and Firestone also talks about how that current could have been interrupted by these massive landslides that happened. So that's going to change the climate dramatically as well.
Right. So a lot of these aren't actual landslides. Did he describe that it is the continental shelf sliding?
No, he talks about there's evidence for massive landslides off the east coast of North America, South America, and Africa.
These are submarine landslides.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you go off New Jersey, the coast, if you go out about 250 miles, it's about 100 feet, 200 feet deep, and then you come to a wall. It's called the wall. That's where you go deep shark fishing. And it drops off to the abyssal plain, thousands of feet down, straight down. And it's almost like a cliff. And
that's where the landslide happens, right?
Yeah, and in geology, the deposit from the landslide is called the turbidity current. It's great time. And we'll be right back with more cool stuff. Welcome to Cosmic Catastrophe.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. There was blood on the wire. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
Join me on the Brian Rouge Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Rouge Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
And we're back. Merry Christmas. Did we say that?
No, I was just thinking the same thing that we talked about Christmas. We didn't actually say Merry Christmas, so we say it now as well. Happy Hanukkah also.
And happy Schwanza. That's what Nancy Pelosi said yesterday in Congress. And this is one of the original March Against Monsanto Philly shirts. Look at that.
Yeah.
No, that's a late one. Look at that. That's a May 21st,
that's from the
2014.
3rd March.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, we were talking about landslides off the continental shelf. And I happen to just be able to find a graphic of turbidity currents. And this is what was happening on the continental shelf during this event. Now, the reason it has to be happening in catastrophic ways for the entire length is because you have millions of these gigantic mile-sized pieces of ice hitting the ground, shaking. Can you imagine? It's hard enough to imagine a 9 magnitude earthquake. Multiply that by 1 million.
Yeah.
That's what's going on here.
Just all these things flying at you, and then just the earthquakes that would be produced, as you already said.
Yeah, and I was going to pull up this account of a mammoth that they unearthed in 1830s in New Jersey, because New Jersey would have been right near the edge of this catastrophic bombardment. So it's getting, probably there's like debris falling down on the ground in New Jersey after the impacts.
Yeah.
Mud and soil that's blown up into space and shit. But there was a mammoth that they uncovered in a bog. So there's a mammoth eating in a bog when the event happens. He's kind of submerged. He's eating plants. And then he gets instantly buried, completely standing upright.
Wow.
That's how they found it.
That's
in the bog. They drained the bog to like do some construction. And they saw a tusk sticking out. And then they drained it more, and then they did this excavation. It was standing.
That's just wild. But it's in such close proximity to the Carolinas, it makes perfect sense. And by the way, like the Atlantic landslide, I just went back and looked, was actually at the Carolina coast.
Of course, that would be where the most catastrophic shaking would be.
Yeah. So it makes perfect sense.
I wish I could pull up some of that evidence. So we've got so many pieces of evidence to suggest that at 12,900 years ago, there's definitely an impact on the ice sheet, and the ice debris is now creating the Carolina bays, rainwater basins, and also creating these massive landslides. So we've got mega tsunamis happening from the bolides hitting the Atlantic, but these types of mega landslides at the shelf also can produce tsunamis.
Yeah, well, that's Firestone's contention, that is the cause of an initial mega tsunami, is the continental shelf landslide.
Well, it would be happening simultaneous with the ice impactors. Does he not mention that?
No, he doesn't talk about that. Not in this chapter, anyway.
That's funny, because if you drop a 1 mile wide piece of ice from space into the ocean.
Right. Right. There's a lot going on here.
It's going to be bad. All right, so there's going to be ice rafting, which means that we've got all these ice cubes in the ocean now. It's like a cocktail drink, right? Filled with crushed ice. And those events in geologic history we refer to as Heinrich events. Have you ever heard of that term? Okay, she's gone.
Sorry, I had to step off for some nose blowing. I'm sorry. What was the term again?
Heinrich events.
Yes, I have heard of that.
Okay, so Heinrich events happen regularly, and they happen on the cosmic clock around 12,000 year cyclicity. Half events, or half of a great year. And so here we have a graph of Heinrich events occurring during the Younger Dryas event. And these are basically ice rafting events, and there seems to be 1, 2, 3 of them. So just like we have 3 cosmogenic signatures with the radionucleotides showing up in the ice cores, we also have evidence that there's ice rafting at all these events. So could it be that these are all impacts on the ice events? And each time there's more and more icebergs getting shot into the ocean?
Certainly possible.
Yeah, it's absolutely a possibility based on the evidence. So the ice on the graph here, the chart of iceberg debris show that a pulse of icebergs, the biggest one, occurred from 13 to 16.5. So it's a span. It seems like at 16.5 it shoots up to a very high amount of icebergs.
Yeah.
And this is the same time, amazingly, at 16.5, where some of the peer-reviewed literature says Lake Missoula begins flooding. The catastrophic scabland floods that Randall Carlson talks about begin at this time, around 17,000 years ago.
Yeah, and it's the same time period as well that Firestone is talking about flooding around the globe as well, for which there's very good evidence.
Yeah, and we can bring up, I had that on break, this graph here, the post-glacial sea level rise. And you can see meltwater pulse 1A happens right around 14,500 years ago. A very rapid rise in sea level, which ends at the Younger Dryas event, 12.9.
Yeah.
And then sea levels are stable all the way to around 11.5, where they rapidly rise again.
Yep.
So what causes sea level to rise 30 meters? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I mean, warming could be part of it, obviously.
Yeah, that's the number one thing. I mean, use Occam's razor. If you've got all this freshwater ice trapped on Earth, you get warming. And then we get cooling during the Younger Dryas event. But let's talk about the warming. What triggers the warming? Because we also have a warming at 11.5. And there's also evidence of the Atacama desert glass at 11.5.
Yeah.
And the paper and the authors, and we agreed, said that this was more comet airbursts. These are comets that are discharging above the surface and melting the surface.
Right.
Same thing happens with the black mats in many regions in North America, where we can see burning and charcoals.
Yeah.
So is it a comet, or could it be the sun?
I think it could be either.
Yeah, because in the Firestone paper, I found a really interesting passage where in the end, he concludes that it's definitely a comet, an asteroid, or a nearby supernova.
Yeah.
But he doesn't say the sun. What the a nearby supernova? It would be from our sun.
Right. Well, I guess he's leaving open possibilities.
Like, they're like, we don't know where the supernova came from. I'm like, hello?
Right. But, regardless of the cause, if it's... One of the things that became very obvious to me reading a couple of chapters of Firestone is that regardless of the cause, that any of these events can trigger other events that ultimately really interfere with the ocean current. And that can have a massive impact on climate. And maybe it's that whole chain of events that is what shifts the temperature so dramatically.
Yeah, the most logical, using Occam's razor again, explanation for how warming causes cooling,
right,
is very obvious. It's called albedo. So if a warming event stops an ocean pattern, and when that ocean pattern was running, it never snowed in Europe, let's say. But then if you shut down the AMOC, it then starts snowing in Europe. The albedo effect starts rapidly cooling Earth, because Earth was in a constant state of whatever warmth it was. But once you start covering Earth with white stuff, it reflects sunlight back into space, and it gets cool rapidly, and the temperature shifts.
Yeah.
Now, let's say you were to have a comet impact the ocean or the ice sheet, and all that material goes up as clouds, water vapor. The Earth would freeze in an instant to an ice age.
Right.
And it would stay that way for a while, especially if all of the ocean circulation stopped.
Yeah.
You freshen up the ocean water. There's no more deep overturning circulations. There's no more nice weather patterns. and it gets very cold very quick due to albedo.
Yeah.
Even if it was very warm when it happened, as soon as you cover the entire Earth in clouds, that's like an ice age.
Right.
Because we know what happens when the sun sets. It gets very cold, very quick. All right, where were we going with this? All right, let's talk about some of the native accounts and myths. So maybe we can start to glean some evidence. Is it a comet? Is it the sun outbursting? And this tale is from the Wintu, which is a California tribe, which has many details in common with the scientific evidence laid out in Firestone's book. An allegory about the world immediately before this one. The story is about the adventures of two brothers called, appropriately enough, Shooting Star and Firestarter. And in the story, just as in the theory, Shooting Star spreads over the landscape long streaks of fire that converge in the north. In fact, the comet debris, being high in hydrocarbons, may have burned like tar or pitch and look like fire streaks. Afterward, heavy rain and meltwater floods spread across the continent. So let's read the account from the Wintu. Firestarter and the World of Fire. In the world before this one, the people were not like us. They had magical powers. One woman called Yanot and her husband, Firestarter, had an especially magical child, so that whenever the child touched, burst into flames. They named it Firechild and were careful to keep his hands off anything that could burn. One day at sunrise, Firestarter became very angry with another tribe that had stolen his fire sticks. To punish them, he and his brother, Shooting Star, touched Firechild with pine-pitched branches, which instantly burst into furious flames. With those torches, Firestarter swiftly raced off to the southwest, and Shooting Star rushed away to the southeast, circling around the other tribe's lands. Now that's interesting.
Yes. I mean, clearly in this case, the children are metaphorical for something that's happening in the sky.
And they've got compass directions.
Yes.
So southwest of the impact. So I wonder if the comet is, it's telling us the direction of the comet.
Yeah.
Firestarter swiftly raced off to the southwest and Shooting Star rushed away to the southeast. So maybe the comet's moving southeast and burning everything behind it into the southwest.
Maybe.
Where they can see the fires behind the Shooting Star moving to the southeast.
I mean, it almost suggests that there was an object that split, but that doesn't really make sense in regard to the directionality. Like if a object split, it wouldn't have one going southwest and one southeast.
Magically covering miles with each stride, they dripped burning pitch from their torches, leaving long streaks of fiery burning flames behind.
Huh?
It sounds like a comet that's dripping lava onto the earth.
Yeah.
We've never seen a comet like that. Soon exhausted, the men met in the north before noon. But when they looked back, the fire had raged out of control, so that long lines of fire stretched from horizon to horizon. Flames raced across the land in giant waves, all over the world. People rushed to escape, some jumping into streams, others hiding in caves. This is literally the story of the younger Dryas catastrophe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they conclude, but most could not escape. The fierce heat was all around them. So this legend explains black mats. It explains the nanodiamonds. It explains why they call us cavemen 12,000 years ago. It explains the mass extinction. It's pretty compelling evidence for the theory.
Yeah. 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 I like too how the next paragraph literally talks about the ground being on fire. So it says,
Yeah.
through the dense smoke, the Creator saw that even the rocks and ground were on fire. Everything was burning. Also, this is interesting. Working quickly, the Creator sent Hummingbird north to smash a hole in the sky. With the force of 100 rivers, water poured down through the cracked sky to flow over the earth below.
So if they're in California, they're not going to get the impactors from the ice. They're going to see another piece of the comet whiz by them and light the ground on fire. Maybe some air bursts. But then it's going to hit the ice about 3,000 miles away from this tribe. And later that day, then they're going to see that plume come towards them. It's going to take a while to propagate thousands of miles in the atmosphere, and it would get dark and start raining for weeks.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah,
the deluge.
there's another account from the Cato people that talks about the fact that it rained for many days and nights, causing the waters of the great oceans to rise higher and higher until there was no land for a long way in every direction.
Man.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. When it was over, the Creator spoke, and all the waters disappeared. So in the interim, the floods put out all the fires, and you would be getting a black mat situation, because not only would it be wet, which causes black mats, but it's also burnt, which causes black mats.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in that layer, you're going to have all the cosmogenic dust that they find, including the nanodiamonds, because this is small asteroids or micro comets that are blowing up all over North America, and big ones that hit the ice sheet.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I'm still very intrigued by the two brothers, one of whom went southeast and one of whom went southwest. I really would like to know what that refers to exactly.
One was Shooting Star and the other one was Fire Starter.
Yeah.
All right. We're looking at some other evidence here with impactors in Bolivia. How much time do we have? We only got 10 minutes. Let's talk about some interesting facts here that I pulled up. This is a graph that I found on grand solar minimums. Now we're going into the next grand solar minimum, or we're actually dipping down into it now, which is the modern eddy minimum. But this shows a reverse correlation, because what we're looking at here is excess carbon-14. And during the peak of grand minimas, we have peaks in excess carbon-14.
Interesting.
And so this is a direct connection to our sun, because during these grand minimas, the sun shuts down, the magnetosphere weakens, and all of the cosmogenic material coming from our sun, not some spurious supernova that they can't identify. The carbon-14 is coming from our sun. And we just proved it right here.
Yeah.
The deeper the minimum, the weaker the magnetosphere, the bigger the spike in carbon-14.
Well, and surely other isotopes as well, right?
Yeah,
like
but
we might
that's just
see like a buildup of barium, for example, on Earth because of a weakened magnetosphere.
Yeah, exactly.
Contrary to the idea of chemtrails, by the way, right? The elements that we're finding more of in certain periods of time, they're not from chemtrails, they're from space and the sun.
Yeah, barium, aluminum from the sun, and they're being ionized in the atmosphere from cosmic rays.
Right.
So here we're looking at a paper that goes back 50,000 years, and this is the radiocarbon or the carbon-14 in the ice core data for the last 50,000 years. And this is something you haven't seen, nor the paper. Just to point it out to you out there, it's mysteriously high delta 14 of the glacial atmosphere, influence of carbon-14 production, and carbon cycle changes. Here's the graph. What do you see?
Well, I see a big peak and then another peak and then kind of another peak, a slow peak, and then a big drop off.
Yeah, so the major peak in the last 50,000 years, that big peak, that's the extinction of Neanderthals. That's the weakest our magnetic field has been in 100,000 years. And so the magnetic field is directly connected to how much carbon-14 is deposited on the surface of Earth. And during that peak, we have a mass extinction of a hominid called Neanderthal.
Fascinating.
There's another peak that's around 34,000, but there's no mass extinction there. And then if you come into the younger Dryas realm, the time we're talking here, which is like 11 to 17,000, that big shaded gray area,
Yeah.
there is not much in the way of change, except around 12,000 years ago. At the 12.9 event, there's a little peak.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the mass extinction is not cosmogenic radiation. The mass extinction is a physical environmental change.
Right.
Because the last mass extinction we had was definitely cosmogenic. Too much space radiation killed off Neanderthals and millions of other mega mammals back 41,000 years ago. That was ultraviolet related. This younger Dryas event was not.
Yeah.
So the animals and creatures that died from this event died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or if they made it, everything was burned. There's nothing to eat.
Right.
Including the Clovis people.
Yeah.
Now, they had the best chance because not all the animals died, and they're people and they're hunters, skilled hunters. So the Clovis made it, and then archaeologists called them
Folsom.
Folsom people.
We've changed the name. They've morphed into a completely different set of people.
Like the Fort Ancient people are different than the Adena. They're the
Right.
same people 1,000 years later.
Right.
Using the same serpent mound. What is it? A whole different culture that's like, hey, a serpent, let's live here.
Right. Well, I mean, to be fair, it's not the worst thing in the world that they were named different groups of people, in the sense that it's a little, if you don't know, if you can't prove that they're the same people, then it's a little bit more objective to, when you see a culture and you see certain trends within that culture, to say, okay, we're going to call this culture and it's distinct from this culture over here. We don't know if they're related. But it is a little silly because people don't just appear out of nowhere.
Okay, here's a different graph from another paper. Atlantic Ocean ventilation changes across the last deglaciation and their carbon implications. And it has a different set of data from a different place on Earth at that same time frame. Here you can see we're going from about 25,000 to 5,000 years ago. And this is the changes in oxygen 18, carbon 14, carbon 13, and so on. So these are more of those cosmogenic fingerprints, and you can see that something big happens at starting 17,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's more of a
and everything
continuous.
follows the same pattern.
Say it again.
And all of these markers follow the same general pattern.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is causing the spike in carbon 14, which also causes warming?
Well, it could easily be a nova.
Yeah, but it comes in for a period of 1,000 years. It gets higher and higher.
Yeah.
So if we're going off of that grand solar minimum graph, this could be a super cycle of the sun where the sun completely shuts down.
Yeah.
And the magnetosphere on Earth wanes, but there's very little evidence that the magnetic field got weak at that time. And if I can pull up that quaternary.
Yeah, how do we determine that?
I have a graph of the magnetic field strength, so we'll talk about that in the next. Well, I'll make some graphics of all the radiocarbon excess spikes and all the papers, and we'll overlay it over the temperature graph and see, and then we'll just have like a general back and forth trying to discuss what could be going on.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
We should have like a big whiteboard or chalkboard where we keep adding to it, like, cosmogenic markers here, impactors here, a Chilean glass here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many different variables in these changes, so it becomes a little bit difficult to determine exactly what causes what.
But after a period of 5,000 years of catastrophic sea level rise, empire-ending floods, starting at 16,500 years ago. There's evidence that the Mississippi Delta flooded in the first pulse. There are massive outwashes in the Pacific Northwest at this time. And then a few thousand years later, we have an impact on the ice, which shuts down the thermohaline circulation in the Atlantic, causes a mini ice age. And then after the mini ice age for 1,500 years, whoever's still alive somewhere over in Turkey is building Göbekli Tepe.
Right. It's like, it's just extraordinary that any of us are even still here. It's like, what?
Well, and so many people made it that when they were building Göbekli Tepe, there were enough skilled artisans to still be able to do that. And archaeoastronomers and everyone left.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
We should not underestimate ourselves and our ability to survive.
Amen to that. It's been a great show. I hope everyone has a happy holidays. And we'll see you next week on another
Holidays.
episode of Cosmic Catastrophe.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this.